The wind was blowing hard that Halloween night. Trees swayed outside, casting distorted shadows on the wet sidewalk. I was already home, but insomnia pushed me out to wander the streets. That's when I noticed a small antique shop with a window full of forgotten objects, each one with a hint of mystery. When I stepped inside, the shop was cold and silent, the air thick, as if time moved at its own pace in there. Wandering between shelves filled with dusty books, cracked porcelain, and old paintings, I saw it. In a corner of the shop, a porcelain doll stood out, seated on a faded armchair. She had a pale, delicately sculpted face and dark glass eyes that seemed to follow me. There was something almost human in her expression, a look that teetered between intriguing and unsettling. The white lace dress was yellowed with age, yet it maintained a strange elegance, as if the doll was waiting for someone to notice her. I approached hesitantly, trying to understand why I felt such an inexplicable attraction. Her eyes were cold, deep, reflecting a gaze that seemed to have witnessed deep secrets mixed with the silence of the years. I felt a chill but couldn't look away. It was as if, somehow, she had chosen me. A strange impulse made me pick her up carefully, examining every detail of that delicate figure. And, despite a growing discomfort, I decided I wanted to take her home. The shop owner, an elderly man with an enigmatic look, glanced at me for a moment before finally giving a slight smile. "She's a rare piece," he said with an almost amused tone. I paid the asking price without a second thought and took the doll in my arms, wrapped in a dark cloth he offered me. As soon as I crossed the threshold of my home, I felt a slight shift in the atmosphere. The apartment, which had seemed normal before, now felt wrapped in an almost reverent silence, as if something had changed it. I placed the doll on a shelf where she was visible to anyone who entered. As I looked at her, the unease started to grow again. Something in her eyes seemed to have changed, a sense that she was watching me more closely than before. But I shook my head, laughing at my own paranoia. After all, it was just a doll, a relic from a time long past. I turned off the lights and went to bed. However, on that first night, when silence became absolute, I heard a faint sound, like a distant whisper. And as I turned over in bed, I had the distinct feeling that someone was watching, just a few steps away. I woke up the next morning feeling exhausted, as if I hadn't slept at all. The night had been filled with strange, fragmented dreams that left me uneasy but without any clear memories of what I had dreamed. I remembered the sound I'd heard before falling asleep and instinctively glanced over at the doll, which remained motionless on the shelf. I shook my head, trying to push away the strange feeling that something was different. But before I could think much about it, the phone rang, pulling me back to reality. The day passed like any other, filled with appointments and distractions that eased that initial discomfort, until night came, bringing with it the familiar silence and darkness of the apartment. Then, as I lay down to sleep, the noises returned. First, it was a soft sound, almost inaudible, like someone dragging something across the floor. I sat up in bed, trying to identify where it was coming from, but the apartment was completely silent. I convinced myself it was just the old building creaking and settling through the night. But the next morning, as I entered the living room, I stopped immediately. The doll was turned, slightly tilted to the side, and her glass eyes seemed focused directly on where I stood. I tried to remember if I had left her in that position the night before, but I was sure I had placed her straight, facing the room. Again, I laughed at myself, thinking I was just being paranoid. It was easy to blame fatigue and stress, to tell myself I was imagining things. I decided to leave her there and went to work, trying to ignore the feeling that something was off. In the days that followed, the pattern began to repeat. Every night, scratching sounds and soft footsteps seemed to come from some dark corner of the apartment, and every morning, the doll was in a different position. Once, I found her turn completely around, as if she wanted to ignore me, or worse, as if she were trying to hide something. My friends noticed I looked exhausted and suggested I throw the doll away. Yet, something in me hesitated. It was as if, no matter how much I wanted to get rid of her, something kept me tied to her. Then, on a particularly cold night, I woke up suddenly, with no apparent reason. The house was silent, and the noises had ceased. I got up slowly, feeling a heavy presence in the air, and went to the living room, where the doll was still on the shelf. But now, looking at her, I noticed something new. There was a fine crack across her face. And, in the dim light, her eyes seemed to smile. The following nights became a continuous nightmare. Whenever I closed my eyes, I was transported to a dark, foggy world where every corner seemed laden with something macabre. At first, the dreams were only fragments, hasty footsteps on a deserted street, the sound of ragged breathing. But soon, they began to take shape. In one of the dreams, I found myself in a dark forest. The moon weakly illuminated the path as I ran, feeling something invisible pursuing me. The panic I felt was visceral, as if death itself was closing in. And at some point in the dream, I saw her, a young woman in a white dress, her face partially hidden by her hair. She looked at me with the same deep eyes as the doll, an expression of despair etched on her pale face. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, the room shrouded in an oppressive silence. But the worst part was realizing that the feeling of being watched lingered, as if something had followed me from the dream into the room. I lay there, motionless, trying to calm my breathing until exhaustion forced me to close my eyes again. As the days went by, the dreams intensified. Each night brought new visions, revealing more details about the mysterious young woman. I saw her walking down a narrow corridor, running through ancient streets, until the vision became clearer, and I found myself seeing through her eyes, feeling the fear and urgency she experienced. One night, at the height of the nightmare, I saw the young woman in a dark room, holding something against her chest while murmuring words I couldn't understand. Suddenly, she looked at me directly, as if she could see beyond time and space. I felt a chill run down my spine. Upon waking, I rushed to the shelf to check on the doll. There she was, with the same gaze, but something in her face seemed to change with each passing night. The crack on her face had widened slightly, as if she were smiling darkly. I could have sworn the crack resembled the scar that appeared on the young woman's face in my dreams. The sense of connection between the doll and me was undeniable. It was as if I was being drawn into her memories, as if she were trying to share her torment with me. It was in that moment I realized, the doll was not an ordinary object. She carried a presence, a tragic story that, somehow, I was being forced to relive. That morning, waking up with the echoes of nightmares still fresh in my mind, I decided I had endured enough. The presence of the doll was draining my energy and disturbing my peace, and something inside me screamed to get rid of her. Coincidence or not, I could no longer ignore the signs. I carefully picked up the doll, trying not to look into those cold glass eyes, and placed her inside a bag. I left the house with quick steps, barely waiting to reach the nearest trash bin. I tossed the bag inside, almost as if I were freeing myself from an oppressive weight, and returned to the apartment feeling a brief and strange relief. That night, I went to bed with the certainty that this would solve everything, that the dreams and the noises would finally cease. But at dawn, the horror was even greater. There she was, sitting on the shelf as always, staring at me with the same enigmatic and dark gaze. I froze, trying to understand how this was possible. I searched the apartment for any clues, maybe a friend trying to play a prank on me, but it was clear that no one had entered. I forced myself to repeat the process. This time, I took the doll far away, leaving her in a deserted park, hiding her among bushes and rocks. But again, the next day, she was back. The crack on her face seemed to have expanded, as if the doll were becoming increasingly corrupted, as if the anger that kept her trapped was intensifying. Faced with my growing fear, I decided to take drastic measures. I tried to burn the doll. I placed her inside a can and struck matches, watching the flames begin to lick at her. But no matter how much the fire burned, the doll seemed to resist, as if wrapped in an invisible protection. In the end, all I got were soot marks that only accentuated her disturbing gaze. Exhausted, I knew there was no escape. Her presence was relentless, and with each failed attempt, I felt the connection between us strengthening. I was trapped, as if the doll had become an inescapable shadow in my life. It was as if she were waiting, watching, and I sensed that the dreams and nightmares were just the beginning of something much darker. that situation was consuming me. I knew I needed to understand what was happening or I would lose my sanity. So, I decided to investigate the origin of the doll. I spent hours researching in online archives and forums about antique objects until I finally found a clue on an obscure website about paranormal events. There was a legend about a young woman named Isabel, who, according to rumors, had been brutally murdered years ago. The image of the doll and the descriptions matched almost exactly with the figure I had in hand. In an old news article, I found the macabre details of the story. Isabel had been a young woman from a humble family, employed as a seamstress for a wealthy lady. On Halloween night, she had mysteriously disappeared, and days later, her body was found in a lake. The investigation never clarified who was responsible, but rumors suggested that she had been murdered by someone close to her. And, most disturbingly, some testimonies said that she was holding a porcelain doll when she was found. Horror overtook me as I read each line. The profile of the young woman matched the figure I saw in my dreams, the pale face, the white dress, the anguished gaze. I felt as if the doll was charged with a dense energy, a suffocating sense of revenge. It was as if Isabel was trapped there, unable to rest until the truth was revealed. I could barely breathe as I tried to process all of this. It was evident that Isabel wanted something from me, that there was something I needed to do. Perhaps, in some way, I was being led to help her find peace, or perhaps, revenge. That night, as I looked at the doll, I noticed that the crack in her face was even larger, almost like a scar spreading, tearing the smile behind her porcelain lips. This was no longer a coincidence. I felt that Isabel was watching me from behind those eyes, and her presence was almost tangible, lingering in the air. The connection between us seemed more intense than ever, and I knew there would be no peace until I discovered what had truly happened to Isabel. I was determined, from that moment on, I would do whatever it took to uncover the identity of her murderer. Perhaps if I brought justice to her spirit, the doll would finally leave me in peace. The events took on a dimension I could never have imagined. After my encounter with the woman, something inside me felt even more intertwined with Isabel and that doll. I decided to return home, but with each step, I felt something dense and dark following me. The sense of oppression was almost tangible, as if the air around me was becoming heavier. Upon arriving at my apartment, I noticed that the environment was much colder than usual, and the doll was exactly where I had left it, but something about it had changed. The glass eyes, which once seemed to gaze into emptiness, now possessed an unsettling intensity, as if they were fixed on me with a specific purpose, a desire for communication or perhaps for revenge. The crack in its face was more pronounced, spreading like a dark scar that made its expression almost human. I stood still, staring at the doll for a few moments, unable to look away. Then, suddenly, a chill swept through the room, and I felt a presence beside me. It was as if Isabel were there, next to me, witnessing the same scene, waiting for something from me. The presence was strong, palpable, and it made me tremble from head to toe. I tried to calm my breathing, but the fear was greater than my will to maintain control. In a moment of impulse, I picked up the doll and placed it on the table, feeling a mix of fascination and repulsion. As if in a trance, I began to speak aloud, calling for Isabel, asking her to manifest and tell me what she wanted from me. The response was immediate. The lights in the room flickered, and the temperature dropped even further. The walls seemed to pulse, and a low, constant noise spread through the air, like whispers in a language I couldn't understand. It was then that the doll began to move its head, slowly and sinisterly, as if responding to my call. Each movement, though subtle, made my heart race. I knew that what was before me was not just an object, it was an extension of Isabel's tormented spirit, an anchor keeping her trapped between the world of the living and the dead, demanding that I do something to free her. For a moment, the room seemed to darken, and an image began to form in my mind, as if I were seeing through Isabel's eyes. I saw flashes of her life, moments of loneliness, anguish, and finally, the moment of her death. I felt her pain, her betrayal, and a hatred that seemed rooted in something much deeper than mere abandonment. The intensity of that experience brought me to the ground, as if I had left my body to witness Isabel's last breath. When I regained consciousness, I realized that the lights had stabilized, but the feeling of being watched was even more intense. I looked at the doll and saw that the crack in its face had expanded even further, almost as if it were shattering from the inside out. I understood that Isabel was pushing me towards something, that the justice she sought had not yet been completed. I decided to take more drastic measures. I took the doll and, without thinking twice, went to the kitchen, grabbed a hammer, and prepared to destroy it. But at the exact moment I raised the hammer, a strong wind swept through the room, preventing me from proceeding. It was as if Isabel was stopping me from breaking her. I was there, caught between fear and determination, trying to understand what she really wanted. At that instant, I heard a low voice, almost imperceptible, echoing in the room. It was not an ordinary sound, but rather a whisper, as if the words were coming from another plane, distant and nebulous. With a mix of terror and fascination, I realized it was Isabel. She murmured something about truth and justice, fragmented words that only made sense within the macabre context I was experiencing. Her presence, which had once been subtle, was now unbearably close, and the atmosphere around me was charged with an overwhelming energy. The doll seemed to be writhing slightly in my hands, as if it were alive. The crack in its face now almost split the face in half, revealing a dark surface beneath the porcelain, a shadow that seemed to devour the doll from the inside out. With a trembling voice, I asked what Isabel wanted, what she needed to finally find peace. And, as if responding, the doll emitted a low noise, a rough sound that echoed in the silence of the apartment. It was a request, a silent command for me to continue the search for the truth. I then understood that destroying the doll was not enough. Isabel was guiding me, showing me that the only way to free her was to confront the reality of her past. I recoiled, dropping the doll onto the table, unable to proceed with the destruction. I felt a chill as I realized that, somehow, I was bound to her fate, trapped in a journey that could only be completed when I revealed the truth about her murder. It was as if Isabel had chosen her own avenger, someone willing to face the dark forces she had left behind. As I stepped back, the environment began to normalize. The cold subsided, and the whisper faded away. The doll was still again, but I knew that Isabel's presence still lingered over me. That night was the last time I tried to destroy the doll. Instead, I decided that from that moment on, I would do everything I could to uncover what really happened. I had accepted my role, and I knew that only by fulfilling this promise would Isabel finally find the rest she so desperately sought. The weight of the recent revelations was overwhelming. I felt Isabel guiding me, forcing me down a path of no return. I spent days revisiting documents, old police records, and finally located the address of the man who had abandoned her and left her on the brink of despair. He was still alive, aged and reclusive, living in an old mansion on the outskirts of the city. I knew that confronting him was my last chance to bring peace to Isabel, but fear and uncertainty consumed me. When I finally gathered the courage, I took the doll in my hands, a silent testament to what Isabel wanted. I drove to the address with trembling hands and a racing heart, and upon arriving, I was met by a somber silence that seemed to envelop the place. I rang the doorbell, and after a few minutes, the door opened. A frail man with a haggard face and thinning hair stared at me with suspicion. In his weary eyes, I saw a mix of arrogance and something more, a remnant of fear. I mentioned Isabel's name, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of recognition cross his face. He tried to compose himself, but his posture revealed that my name and my visit were far from welcome. I invited myself in, and he hesitantly allowed it, possibly believing there was no reason to fear me. We sat in a richly adorned yet decaying room, filled with dusty portraits of a life he seemed to prefer forgetting. I began to narrate what I knew about Isabel. I told him about what I had learned, about her death and the void she had left behind, a gaping wound that had never healed. His once cold eyes began to waver. As I described her torment, he attempted to mask his discomfort, but his trembling hand betrayed him. His defense crumbled when I finally revealed the doll. I placed it on the table between us, and he looked at it with a genuine expression of horror. She was never just a distraction, was she? I asked, letting the silence stretch. He averted his gaze, his voice faltering as he replied, as if struggling with a long-repressed guilt. After a long, heavy pause, he murmured, almost to himself, that he never expected Isabel to cling to him so desperately. In his view, Isabel was merely a youthful mistake, a passionate woman he thought he could abandon without consequences. But he was wrong, and now the past refused to let him rest. I explained then that Isabel was still here, that her spirit was bound to that doll, haunting everyone who touched her story. His reaction was one of panic. He stood up abruptly, staggering backward, as if the mere presence of the doll were a real threat. The fear on his face was evident, but I realized there was no true remorse, only a selfish terror at the thought of being haunted by what he had done. He began to plead, asking me to take the doll away, to destroy it or to carry it far from there. "You don't understand," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Isabel doesn't want me to destroy the doll. She wants the truth to be told, for you to admit what you did." But he refused, clinging to the illusion that he could escape, as he always had. The confrontation reached a point of no return. With no other option, I left the doll on the table, staring at him one last time. "She will never let you be at peace until the truth comes to light," I declared, my voice echoing in the empty room. I knew Isabel was there, watching, waiting for her justice. The pain and anger I felt now were not just hers, they were mine too. I wanted revenge for her, I wanted him to pay for what he had done. As I left, I glanced back and saw the man cowering in fear, his eyes fixed on the doll, unable to confront his guilt and his past. I knew Isabel was still there, and that he would never have peace while she remained trapped in that cycle of torment. It wasn't the complete justice I had hoped for, but at least he felt a drop of the terror Isabel had endured, and that was a start. I returned home with a strange feeling, a mix of relief and unease. The confrontation had brought a sort of conclusion, but a shadow lingered, a sense that something was still unresolved. The doll, which I had left with the man, seemed to have fulfilled its role, but Isabel, she was still with me, in some way. I could feel her presence around me, like an invisible current that never broke. In the following nights, the apartment became silent and cold, the same type of chill that preceded Isabel's manifestations. But this time, it wasn't the doll that disturbed me, it was a feeling of emptiness. There was a weight in the atmosphere, as if Isabel were still trapped, but now no longer bound to the object that symbolized her pain. She seemed lost, caught between the liberation she sought and something that still held her, however vaguely, to the world of the living. As the days passed, I began to question whether what I had done really brought peace to Isabel. Was confronting the one responsible for her downfall enough? Perhaps she wanted more than just fear and regret, perhaps she hoped for him to confess publicly or for true redemption that never came. After all, the man had only shown selfish fear and persisted in his cowardice, refusing to face his past with honesty. One night, while staring into the emptiness of my room, I felt a chill run up my spine. The temperature dropped sharply, and for a moment, a shadow passed through the mirror in front of me. It was her, or at least, a fleeting impression of Isabel. Her face appeared in the reflection, pale and somber, the vacant gaze of a tired and lost soul. That image lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to make me realize that Isabel was still trapped, perhaps to me, or to the very resentment she carried. That last vision of Isabel stayed with me in the following days. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that it was all in my head, but the feeling that I carried something dark continued. And so I realized that perhaps Isabel didn't just want liberation for herself, perhaps she also wished to pull me into her pain, as if I were now the sole guardian of her story, destined to live with this shadow until, somehow, her justice was fully realized. I began to lose sleep, dominated by intense dreams in which Isabel guided me through scenes from her past, showing me fragments of her life and her death, always with that sad and vacant expression. In one of those dreams, I heard her voice, soft and distant, whispering that she wanted rest. I woke up in a cold sweat, understanding that even after everything, I was powerless to completely free her. Her pain persisted, and I was her only link to the physical world, the last to carry her memory. Reality became indistinct. Isabel's presence was a constant weight, and little by little, I began to understand that she had become a part of me, a ghost I would carry. My everyday life grew less clear, and my thoughts were invaded by flashes of her, as if we were intertwined in an endless cycle. The attempt at justice had failed to bring peace, and I was trapped in this ambiguity, sensing that Isabel would not separate from me anytime soon. On that last night, before finally leaving the apartment, I looked around, feeling her absence in the environment, but not in myself. Isabel was no longer trapped in the doll, nor in the man who had destroyed her. She was with me, an ethereal and ambiguous presence, blending into my own life like a shadow that never completely fades away. And as I closed the door, I understood that somehow, she would always be there, a living reminder of a story that would never have a true ending.